So I'll start by just saying, again, thank you for joining us. This is part of our ongoing series looking at narrative intelligence. So, narrative intelligence, if you've seen our previous stuff, you'll know it's this whole new way of approaching research, which kind of really aims to reflect the complexity, the size, the speed of culture, the news cycle, and all the crazy stuff we're seeing around us on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, none of these things are static. None of these things wait conveniently to be analyzed. It's all moving at speed. So the questions kind of become, well, how do you analyze this stuff like mid-flight, so to speak, and see all the different places it's going. We've actually, conveniently enough for us, we devised a tool to help people understand this. It's called Narratives AI. We think it's the first search engine for public opinion. When I say we, I'm largely referring to a product team led by Fran, who's on this call, who you'll be seeing shortly. It's the royal we.
Alex is being way too modest. He literally built it from scratch by himself in his garage. He's just being modest.
I have to answer to the product team now after this. They'll be very upset. But yeah, I mean, the point of this series is very much to bring, you just see the glimpse of Safi there, is to bring smart people from across the industry who have been, looking at narrative intelligence, using it, learning a bit more about their approach, how that maps onto what we're trying to achieve with the products. And yeah, just trying to have a real free, open conversation. I mean, maybe I'll shut up for a second and let both our panelists introduce themselves. I mean, Safi, people already saw you pop up there. Do you want to share a bit about yourself?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Safaniya Stevenson. I also go by Safi. I'm a brand strategist and cultural analyst based here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and have been using narratives for the last couple of months. And it has really elevated my ability to do brand research, messaging, positioning, and also be a better cultural analyst. So excited to talk today.
Awesome. Yeah. Maybe kick it over to you, Fran, as well.
Great. I'm Francesco D'Orazio. I'm the founder of Pulsar, and I've been obsessed about narratives for the last 10 years. And finally, in the last year and a half, we managed to bring something to market that does a little bit of the job that we had in mind when we started thinking about narratives. And I love this series because it helps us talk to people that are the pioneers of narrative intelligence, using these tools and doing stuff with those tools in real life tasks and jobs and problems and scenarios. So we just want to use the opportunity to just talk to people like Safi and get, how do you use it? What do you do with it? What's the value for you? And what should we do better?
Awesome. Yeah. And a really convenient episode, this actually, because you've probably heard three very different voices and accents there. So if you're ever wondering who's talking, you'll never be in doubt. You'll always know who it was who said that last thing. And one other thing, point of order before we move on, we want to leave ideally around like 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a bit of a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please chuck them in the chat and we'll come back to them at the end and we'll try to answer those, maybe kick off some new conversations. Do our best to come back to you there. So I think maybe the best place to start is it's actually one of the whole reasons why we were so excited to have this with you, Safi, actually, was you described narratives AI a while ago as turning vibes into insight. And we just loved that. We thought that was such a neat way of describing it. So, I mean, love to dig into that some more. Like, could you maybe explain a little bit about like what that meant to you? Just love to hear more from you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of what a brand strategist job is to bottle up and create vibes for your brand. And before now, it's hard to like quantify or do research around a vibe. You have to put a name to it, put a face to it, and start to do research. And really, what Narratives AI has allowed me to do is take the piece that I know I want to create a vibe around, or if I'm doing a competitor analysis, I'm like, this brand has a vibe. They're doing something really cool here. What is the conversation? What's the narrative that's happening? And being able to really quantify something that hasn't been quantifiable in the past. So that's what Narratives AI has helped me do. It's like, it's not just a vibe anymore. I can actually pull reports, be able to speak directly to conversations that are happening. I would say before Narratives AI comes around, the best way I might describe it to, especially if we have brand strategists or analyst folks in the room today, is we would always kind of pull from a social listening tool, sentiment analysis, right? Like it's the little pie chart and it shows you negative, positive, neutral. And as a one single person, I can't go through the millions of tweets, Reddit threads, Instagram comments, blogs, to individually read all the things that are making up the negative sentiment or the positive sentiment or the neutral sentiment. And what Narratives AI does now is I can go back and actually add context to what is coming out of a neutral section or what is coming out of a negative or positive, and actually put conversation to it versus just me cherry picking, 2 or 3 tweets that I have time to pull. Really being able to add context and data behind vibes and behind kind of like that sentiment, which we haven't been able to do until pretty much now.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think the other thing that's so cool about vibes is there's a certain like inherent, I guess, lightness to that word, right? People hear vibes,
Yeah.
they're like, oh, like vibes. But I know a big part of like why Fran wanted to build a product in this way is that vibes are actually, you should take them really seriously, right? Like vibes are actually like, they coalesce into narratives, they are themselves narratives. And that drives so much across like society at the moment. I mean, we're all seeing it now, right? And from the economy,
Right.
I mean, there's crypto, there's the stock market, there's elections, there's narratives around businesses and brands. And I guess Fran, like, knocking over to you, that was a big part as to why build this tool in the first place.
Yeah, I think that the context of this is we live in the age of spin, and in the age of spin, the reality of the thing kind of takes a second kind of like spot or a backseat spot in the conversation you have, when it's all about how the thing that is being discussed is being spanned by the people that are in that discussion, and who has a louder voice, and who has the best connection, and who has the best network, and the best way of kind of like developing that spin into something. And that got us thinking that the the idea that stories drive behavior is true today more than ever. Like there hasn't been a time in history where the idea that stories drive behavior is more powerful than it is today. And so we thought, like, can we build a way of detecting those stories and quantifying those stories, because that would help us then understand how behaviors change. And then the other thing that we realized when we did that is that we couldn't just build a way of detecting stories within a bubble that you defined. Like when you do traditional social listening, you use a bunch of keywords, collect a bunch of data that match those keywords. And then within those, you can do really smart things and really amazing analysis. But all you're doing is you're looking within your little kind of like aquarium, if you like. And within that aquarium, you're trying to detect the undercurrents. And we thought, like, actually, that's not how the real world works. So you need to be able to understand those stories out in the wild. And to do that, we go like, oh, shit, we actually need to map the entire space and create a list of all the stories that exist in the entire data set globally, and then see where the story that matches what you're interested in to fit, and how it connects to stories that you didn't even think existed. And I think that's been the biggest heavy lifting for this product. And that's why we started by exposing the narratives, because for us, that's like, okay, we've identified a thing that you can now touch, or touch, metaphorically touch, we can measure and quantify, but now we can link it to everything else. It's not just isolated within your little query that you run, it's in the world, and we can connect things to it that you didn't think were connected. And that, I think, is where the value is.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have people who are joining us from previous sessions, maybe some users actually of narratives as well, but I'm aware we'll also have a lot of people who maybe haven't used narratives before. So I wonder, Fran, is it worth sticking with you for 1 second, maybe giving a sort of a very potted summarization of kind of how narratives goes about collecting that kind of data, how it works, before we then kind of go back to Safi
Yeah,
a bit
I
more.
get this out of the way. So
Yeah.
in very simple terms, it takes any data that is available from a data source. So it takes, if you like, a fire hose stream of data rather than a selection based on what you're interested in. It then detects within that fire hose stream of data all the different types of narratives that exist, which are effectively a system of topics that travel together over time. You can define it like that if you like. And then maps how that system of concepts and ideas and topics evolve over time, how they're connected to each other, and then it tracks where they go to and from, so that you can see where a story originated from, where did it get to in the end, and what shape was it into at the end of that journey. And then it puts all of those stories into an index. Imagine like an endless list of hundreds of thousands of stories that exist. And so when you then go into narratives and you search for climate change, we match your need of understanding climate change to all the stories that exist that have something to do with climate change. And obviously we rank those stories by relevance and by velocity. So how big are those? which ones are shrinking, which ones are growing, and which ones are kind of like more in line with the specific question that you asked. And a combination of those gives you a list that you can effectively then look. And then what we do is, because we realize that even that is not enough to make sense of this chaos, it's like, let's try and cluster all those stories into themes and then give you an understanding of what is in each theme, so that you can then get a breakdown and understand from that breakdown what are the key themes around climate change and what are the top narratives driving that specific theme within climate change. And obviously you can look at this on the media side, or you can look at it on the social side. And we thought it was quite useful to split the two, because you have very different stories being told in the media versus what is being told in the public. Sometimes they're connected, they feed off each other, but very often they have a very different life in terms of like how the story evolves in both sides. So we thought it's better to keep them separated, and then it's down to you to understand what the gaps are and what's interesting.
Brilliant. Thanks, Fran. So that's all the technical stuff sorted. Now, I think what we wanted this session to be a lot about was you've got all that like technical know-how. What does that actually look like for someone who's going pretty early adopter? I think it's fair to say, like, narrative intelligence is not a very mature mode of research. So what does that look like for someone like Safi, who's trying to take all of that insight and fit it into the workflow that you have as a brand consultant? So maybe let's start there for a second, Safi. Like, before we get into like the exact minutiae, like, how does this fit into your broader modus operandi as a brand consultant?
Yeah, I think Fran hit it on the head when he was talking about the fact that we have to look beyond the aquarium for like our work, because the work that we're doing or the industry, we can't be just laser focused. And, everyone can use a little bit of therapy. So one of my favorite therapy notes that as a brand strategist has helped me, and also what Narratives AI helps me do, is the best piece of advice I ever got was, it's okay to change your mind based on new information you receive. And with narratives, what it allows me to do is to be able to get these different inputs to influence where a campaign can go, where a brand positioning can go, where a PR campaign can go. And one of the coolest examples I have, and shout out to Holly at Pulsar as my client management person who kind of did the live demo with me, is we were testing out the product, and we're like looking at, she's like, well, what should we look at? Let's look at a product level, industry level. And we were looking, she's like, what are you interested in? I was drinking a matcha. She was like, well, let's just do matcha. Because you like matcha, that's what we're going to do. And so for me, going in with blinders, if I'm a matcha company, I'm like, I want to listen and know more about people's sentiment and the narrative around matcha. But what was so crazy is we were pulling in all these different, kind of like what Fran said, where it's like, it shows you the conversation, but it also shows you the tentacles that branch out from a certain theme. Is a query came up and it was like matcha rave. And me and Holly went down this rabbit hole of what a matcha rave is. Was that on my bingo card for that day to learn about matcha raves? It wasn't. But if I was a matcha brand, I now have a new thing to look into. Like, where are matcha raves happening? What part of my audience is attending these matcha raves? Or I work in higher education, and one of the things that I think also thought about as me and Holly were going through that was, at the very beginning of the school year, they like to have some like party or kickoff. And back when I was in college, it would be like a bubble rave or like a light paint rave. But now Gen Z is very health conscious, and they aren't doing as much drinking or consuming things like that. So we could do a health-based, rave at a higher ed institution. We could do a matcha rave. That could be a great opportunity for us to bring in student health services, a local cafe, wellness partners. So what started out as we're just going to look at matcha to see how people are talking about matcha, turned into being introduced to matcha raves, why it came around and why it existed. And as a brand strategist, I now have new things to act on, new things to bring back to a creative director or a creative team to think, or an experiential or an event team to say, hey, did you guys know that matcha raves are a thing? And they're kind of cool. So that's the way practically that I've been using narratives AI, because again, it's okay to change your mind when you're introduced with new information, and narratives AI really gives me an opportunity to see and hear conversations I would have never imagined or thought of.
I love that. I love that because that when you search for something very specific like matcha,
Hmm.
and the way the system is built, effectively, you see a connection to soft clubbing, which is the whole idea of like health conscious clubbing. And
Hmm.
then matcha rave is obviously a connection between those two spaces. But if you were not using something like that, you wouldn't see the connection. There would be like
No,
trying some conversation about matcha, but you wouldn't have a connection to the trend of soft clubbing that is the other narrative that is emerging that has nothing to do in theory with the drink
right.
matcha, but now it does. And so for me, that's also the most invaluable thing of what narratives does.
Or even doing just simple like social listening. Like I could have gone into a social listening tool and typed matcha, but it's really going to just give you that singular focus, because I wasn't going in saying matcha plus rave and or rave. That wasn't going to be a part of my query. It was just going to pull up the most relevant pieces, which I imagine would have just been consumer, as far as like it's good, it's bad, it's at the coffee shop, it's not at the coffee shop. And then another really cool piece about the matcha that Holly and I went down was like social consciousness and cultural engagement and cultural sensitivity. Like there was an underlining narrative about, in Asian culture there has been like a little bit of friction between the matcha consumption, because in other countries, we, because it was so trendy, we were actually over consuming ceremonial matcha that Asian countries needed for their ceremonies. And so it made me think about like consciousness and just culture and connectivity. And it's like, do I really need ceremonial matcha? Like, do I personally need that, or should I save that for the people that actually have a ceremony and show respect and kindness to consumers that need it for that? So that was another one. So again, we went from just like people love it, people like it. We had matcha raves, and then we also had cultural sensitivity and divisiveness about the overconsumption of the product. And those are just things you're not going to get from a simple social media query, and you're not going to get it from a simple Google search either.
And the thing that I actually also value about that is the speed at which you can get some of that. So when you do research, as you know, you can get into pretty deep rabbit holes, right? And then the deeper you get into the rabbit hole, the more you get committed to exploring that path. And
Mhm.
I think that introduces a lot of bias in the way you do research and you do strategy. Because once
Right.
you've found your path, then you kind of like have a lot of like bias against, disinvesting from that path. But if you can actually quickly explore that path and not don't commit a lot of time to it, but you just want to see
Right.
how deep this masquerade thing is, how deep is the soft clubbing idea, then you can go back and abandon that if you see that the size of that thing is not big enough for you to get involved in the market. And
Right.
I think that's quite valuable in insight work, because in insight work we tend to overinvest on the hypothesis stage of the strategy work when
Hmm.
I think that this is happening with Gen Z, and then you go and do a whole research piece on that, and then you pray that that research that you spend tons of money and weeks and months on is going to confirm
Yeah.
your hypothesis, because if it doesn't, you have a lot of
Yeah.
explaining to do to a lot of people. But
Yeah.
now actually you can have a quick look at whether the thing is going in that direction or not, and then you can kind of like disinvest on that. You go like, well, you know what, we looked at it, there's like 10 teams around matcha, soft clubbing is not one of them, we're just gonna
Hmm.
go, it's not gonna be the main one. But
Yeah.
you haven't
Or
committed.
vibes.
Oh,
The
vibes.
vibes.
That's why I like the
Yeah.
vibes.
Yeah. And like what Alex said too earlier, it's like vibes has that light positive piece, and like you said, if you have that bias of I'm going to go down the track of positive matcha and that's what I'm going to be set on, there is a vibe that was available that was not so positive about overconsumption and taking away resources from a particular culture. So like you said, it's being able to see both sides of the coin, and it allows us as brand strategists, especially when you're in the cultural analytics space, is to have a high degree of just like intellectual honesty and integrity as well, because like you said, you go down this rabbit hole, or you're hyper focused on this positioning or this language, but when you're quickly and easily introduced to new things that can change your mind about how to position it, how to say it, how to visually represent it, it allows you to be intellectually honest about the campaign that you launched and to have integrity around why you chose to make the creative decisions that you made or the brand decisions that you made. And I think now more than ever, we need to have a lot more intellectual honesty and integrity in like the world of brand and culture, because it's starting to get a little bit scary out here with people just throwing things to the wind because either they're failing to do the research, or two, they're failing to acknowledge new information they've received and they should have changed their mind about a few of the choices they've made. So just throwing out there too, because I think it at least helps from a brand strategy, being brand strategist standpoint, going in, putting the narratives in to say, hey guys, I know we want to run this matcha campaign. Here are some things to consider about the narratives that are happening that are both negative, positive, or neutral. And we can be intellectually honest about the decisions we've made, and we can have high integrity about what we're putting out based on the decisions we're going to make now that we know these conversations and narratives exist.
So let's continue on that path that you were drawing on, like the from matcha to matcha raves to soft clubbing. So once you've identified that, what's the next step for creative strategy? Where do you take that insight to? Let's say soft
Yeah.
clubbing, matcha raves become a thing that is interesting for you to explore because you quantified it in the list of narratives and themes. It's big enough. That what do you do next with that?
Research, additional research. So, being able to go in and take, because another thing that gets pulled in is like just the historical and like Genesis. Like it'll tell you the exact article that the pull quote was taken from, or the X piece, or the Reddit feed. So just being able to click through and platform to go to the source, read it yourself. Also, one of the pieces that it's not matcha related, but it was the Tomato Girl Summer post. And after this, if you all look me up on LinkedIn, I'll just put all the links to all these things I'm mentioning so like you understand. But the Tomato Girl Summer post, the reason why it's important to do the research is because Tomato Girl Summer was vibe induced. It was like one day I was sitting around, I see all these girls talking about like curating their life around having a tomato girl summer. But as I got into narratives, and it gave me other different aesthetics to look up. So it gave me like cottage core, it gave me clean girl aesthetic, it gave me homestead aesthetic. So the next step after that is, if it's giving me aesthetics, or if it's giving me like these keywords or movements, I now have to do the actual historical research on it, because I want to make sure that whatever aesthetic that I'm putting forth, it's actually in alignment with the history, the energy, the original vibe that it was set out to have. So with the Tomato Girl Summer post and the research that I did on it, cottage core and homestead core and trad wife core, they're all based a lot in and Tomato Girl in particular came from kind of like these stems of victory gardens from like World War II. And that is important because the victory gardens around the World War II era were not about overconsumption. It's not about flashiness. It's not about gaudiness. It's not about shine. So if we're talking about now, we've got Tomato Girl Summer as a vibe. We know the history, and we want to execute on a Tomato Girl influencer campaign or creator campaign or aesthetic. I know from a creative perspective, when I give this to a creative director, they're not going to be sending me flashy silver and gold and gaudy because it's anti the aesthetic. Like World War II Victory Garden was all about homestead. It was about small. It was about community. It was about doing with what you had, because the victory gardens came around of like there being food shortages and lack of access to food. So we're not going to do a Tomato Girl Summer campaign by going, we're going to go to Wegmans and get every tomato that ever existed and we're going to try it out. It's more so, hey, I just so happen to have a tomato that's getting ready to go bad. So I'm going to make a quick sauce with it. That's tomato girl aesthetic. And that's based on the history of the narrative, the history of that, not, oh, it's just tomatoes. So we'll just buy tomatoes. You actually have to honor the
I hate
history that it comes from.
I hate to do this, but I think you need to spend 10 seconds to explain what Tomato Girl Summer is.
So Tomato Girl Summer is this aesthetic where it's one, lots of red, lots of tan. I know it's like a polished, clean piece of like gardening, homemaking, being able to do recipes at home and have kind of like these small, intimate parties. It's about finding luxury in everyday normalness.
Mhm.
So a normal day can have a shine, a glimmer because you have everything you need at home. And you can be luxe at home with your one tomato, your one little stick of basil, your one cotton dress, and your one pair of gold earrings. And that is luxurious because you own it. And that's you. So Tomato Girl Summer is all about refined looks and making what you have luxurious from a homestead perspective. And again, that aligns with the fact that it's based in a mixture of like clean girl aesthetic and cottage core, and those all nod back to historical significance of just different aesthetics and lifestyles.
I think that's such a great example. I guess partly it's also these days we cycle through these aesthetics and moments so much faster than we ever did in the past. So almost by the time a lot of like researchers would get a handle on something, it's too late. It's like, it's
Too
gone
late.
mainstream, it's gone boring. I guess a
Yeah,
lot.
because Tomato Girl is not around. Like tomatoes are done here in
Yeah.
the US. Tomato season is done. Like we're done with tomatoes. So we can't, while you're waiting for legal to get back to you, tomatoes are done. They're
So
not
you
in
don't need to
season anymore.
research to get back to you.
Yeah. So like you said, we go through it super fast, but it's being able to find them, and when you see the narrative and the introduction of it, just go ahead and take the moment and hash it out, see if it's a viable option for the brand, get it to a creative, see if they've got any ideas, and then keep pushing it forward because like you said, everything is just moving at the speed of culture, which is super fast.
So when you go into narratives, do you start from I'm interested in the entry points. Do you
Mhm.
start from a product or do you start from a category? Do you start from a trend? What's the way in that you found the most useful to get something valuable out of it?
I would say thus far it's been a mixture of both. So Tomato Girl, that was something I pulled from Instagram where I saw another brand. They were, I want to say it may have been Neiman Marcus. They had like a tomato purse.
Mhm.
And they were like, this is the perfect purse to add to your Tomato Girl summer aesthetic. And I was like, huh? What? So going in and looking, like learning about what it is there, or coming in from a just general topic. For instance, I know we were talking about the rapture earlier. That was one. It's just like a general topic, something that was new, like that was timely, and had news value. And again, being able to see media conversation around the rapture versus
Sorry,
uh,
let's explain that too. Let's explain. If you explain Tomato Girl Summer, I think we can explain Rapture.
yeah, so the rapture in religion is the day that Jesus comes back and the world is renewed. And so being able to I'm trying to I don't want to upset anyone religiously, so just being able, like, it's technically the world ending, but for Christians they see it as everyone who believes in the Lord, they will be reborn again. People who don't aren't reborn again, and it's basically a cleansing and renewal of the earth. And so what was happening, what was that in September, August time, if you were online at all, you heard all these jokes and all these memes about the rapture must be coming, like what's going on? And when you look at the narrative of it, it was more so a stream, like a through line of people just having an overall lack of optimism. Like it was just voluminous lack of optimism. And so since people don't see hope around the corner, they're like, this must be the end. This is the end, guys. We got to hang it up. There's no more optimism,
Right.
no more hope. This is the end.
There are reasons for that. You can see why some people would see it that way.
Yeah, yeah. And again, like that's just being into. to be able to categorize, well, to have narratives also create categories and themes, because there were different themes around why people believed the rapture was happening, back in August or September. Some people were citing like religious teachings and things in the Bible. Some people were saying it was a matter of the international unrest between the US and all of the other countries. Some people were just saying something's just weird, like something's just off and I don't understand why. So being able to, again, like take things that either you're hearing in the news. I know for me sometimes I just go in and like to put in the query just to see, hey, what's this topic, what's the narrative, or specifically working on things. And again, I do like a lot of teaching and posting on LinkedIn about like cultural intelligence. So I also like to look it up by brand to see what is the narrative around that brand and why do I think it's such a good example for like cultural engagement or cultural fluency. So I had like a query about like Fortnite because I wanted to know why Fortnite was so popular amongst so many different people. I mean, you have grandmas that are playing Fortnite. You have like the viral videos of like the lady like holding her baby, like feeding a bottle, and like she was playing Fortnite with one hand. And I'm like, what is there drugs in this game? Like what's happening? And so being able to even look up and see like competitors or things that are just trending and being able to anchor why these things are trending or why people find them cool. So it's a mixture of brand level, industry level, or newsworthiness level. It's where I, at least where I start. So it's no bad answer because I have found that narratives has picked up on whether I specifically put a brand name in, whether I put an event name in, or if I just put something high level like video games, makeup, matcha, something like that. It will give me pretty decent queries, no matter what level you're trying to explore.
You go in more from the news side or the public side? Like what do you find
Public,
public? Yeah, me too.
yeah,
Find the news side too polished and kind of like controlled to give real insights, unless
yeah.
you use it as a kind of like contrast piece to what's up on
Hmm.
the public side. So the public gives you the raw stuff, the
Yeah. Yeah,
juicy.
the public, the media side, I'm like, I know what that says already because I know the work our PR team is doing. So hopefully, you basically what the PR team is working on, you see it in real time on narrative. So I'm like, okay, good job, PR team. The news is saying exactly what we want them to say. Now, public, let's get to that.
Well, that tension can be so interesting, right? I think we often see
Mhm.
that's where it's kind of where you get a lot of opportunities, also where you get a lot of risk, where's the gap opening up and where is, as you say, where's our message got like that broader take up, but where are the two things like really out of sync? And I guess if you're like a brand consultant, you can be like, yeah, you guys are pitching yourself in this way, but everyone's talking about you for this completely other thing. And maybe you should like address that a little bit more in your communications.
Right. And that's kind of like what we opened with is being able to look at that positive negative sentiment and actually say, okay, but what is the actual conversation that's happening? Like what in this negative bucket, what are people actually saying? Or just not hang also what we perceive the positive narrative to be, it might be something completely different. Like for instance, with Fortnite, the positive for me before I started like actually looking into Fortnite as a brand was I'm just thinking it's great gameplay. Like it's just a solid game. It's interesting. You get immediate reward. And if I were to see a positive sentiment with kind of like that brand bias of I work for Fortnite, I see we've got overwhelmingly positive sentiment. It must be because the gameplay is amazing. But on the narrative side, a lot of the positivity comes from community building, like the functionality of Fortnite to be able to do the emotes together. Like, oh, we can all emote and have the same skin on and we're dancing together and we're all buddies and friends. Another really positive thing that gets talked about on the public side of Fortnite is diversity and inclusion. There are so many different types of characters with different types of skin color, with different types of hair textures, with different types of backstories. Because, like, all the Fortnite characters have lore and a backstory, and they all have diversity there. And so you can go in with that bias of, oh, it's just great gameplay. And that's why Fortnite is so amazing. But then there are narratives out there about Fortnite being just an inclusive space and a community building space, which gives Fortnite more to build on. They know to never switch away from diversity, equity, inclusion when it comes to creating new characters. They know to never discontinue the cool dances and being able to emote together because it is underlining the positive sentiment around the brand. But you don't get that from a social listening query and a pie chart that just shows you the percentage of positive and negative, which I think is super important. Kind of just closes the gap, closes the loop of understanding.
I also think that the social listening space has been plagued by this obsession with sentiment, which is a very binary way of reading things. And the stories that we tell ourselves to explain how the world works are very nuanced, and the same story can have positive angles and negative angles within the same idea. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so that idea of, for example, like soft clubbing and masha raves, right? You can't say if there's a positive or negative, because there would be a generation of people like me that would be extremely negative about that because I grew up in the very unhealthy age of raving and clubbing, and
What?
I think he has to stay that way because you need to take some risks in your life. Really a fun. But if you are instead in a new kind of like mindset where you don't see the need for wrecking your health and you still want to have fun, and for you that's an alternative to that,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't see that as like kind of like capitalist exploitation of nonsense or non-productive time, which is what clubbing in my generation used to be,
Mm-hmm.
like non-productive time to the highest extent, right? But you can see how the same story can be seen as negatively or positively, depending on the angle that you look at it from. Sometimes that angle is demographic, sometimes is cultural affinity, sometimes is the country that you're coming from. You know, and so with narratives, we really like one of the first thing that we decided was we're not gonna add a sentiment score to the narrative, because the narrative can be many different things depending on who's looking at it and the context.
Mm-hmm.
But what we added in was, and I don't know if you've seen the latest release, I don't know if you've seen it yet, but for every narrative, now you can see what cultural trends the narrative is connected to, uh,
Mm-hmm.
what is the context that the narrative is originating from, and what outcomes can we expect off the back of the narrative. So if we're saying that, for example, if we're saying that the healthcare system in the UK, for example, is a big narrative, the healthcare system is under strain because of migrants. And that narrative obviously implies that the outcome is that people are going to start protesting against immigration because it puts a strain on the systems. And and for me, that's the most valuable connection. What is the potential outcome that we can expect from that narrative taking root? And the other thing that we're trying to do is also teach people that these narratives, they are not reality. They can become reality, but they are just the things that are circulating around us that are shaping how people behave. But we're not saying that those things are true or not. We're just saying these things are out there in these measure. So you gotta consider them when you try and understand how the audience is gonna behave next.
Yeah.
Mm.
And what you mentioned too about how something can have positive and negative like around the same thing. It was one of my first introductions to that. And AI has gotten so smart, and like the tools have advanced so far, because I remember one of the first instances of this where I was like, whoa, I cannot trust what is just coming out of like social listening tools, and how AI at the time was just like reading and categorizing negative and positive, because language and cultural language plays a really big factor in how things are categorized. The first instance I had was, I was like, man, there's a lot of negative sentiment around this particular brand that I was working with. And when I pulled out the individual negative queries, it was because culturally, the African American community and the tweets that it was coming from, they were saying, oh, that's my shit. Oh, that's the shit. But a computer is going to see the word shit and be like negative, 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 when in reality it was a language difference. So I just it's interesting how though, and like you said, you can have two words that are positive and negative, and it really is up for the end user to think about how we use it and how we categorize it ourselves. Because two things can be true at once. Like shit can be bad and shit can also be good in the social listening world. So to be able to pull both of those and to be able to see the queries themselves and be able to read it. But now with narratives, you get to take it a little bit further because it starts to group things. And I think had narratives been around back then, then it would have been more clear. Like it would have grouped a theme and said, hey, all these people are saying XYZ. And it maybe wouldn't have been marked as negative because it was saying at volume, people are making a certain type of comment in response to product launch or product selling out or something like that, versus social listening is just looking at the one, two, threes and volume versus the context that it's being used, which I think is super important, especially if you're talking to different audiences that have different vocabularies and use language very differently.
And,
Mm.
and talking about vocabularies, when you speak to your clients about narratives, I found that most clients are really excited about the idea of like working on narratives, but they all come to that conversation with very different expectations of what a narrative is. Um, what's your experience with that? Do you go in and they immediately click with what you're saying, or do you get very different type of assumptions?
I think it's mixed. I think it's narratives is pretty clear for people who have been doing like deep comprehensive brand work for a while, where they know that narrative is a combination and summary of lived experiences, actions, ideologies, and beliefs. Versus when you say narratives to folks maybe who are newer to the concept, they think of a message, like a tagline or a simple like one line or two lines versus a comprehensive like fabric of something. So narrative is like the storybook. Like you read a book all the way through and you come away with like the narrative, versus ripping one page out of the book and you're reading a few messages, which is different. So just having to talk to people about like what I'm going to pull for you or what you're going to see is not a tagline. Like it's not a brand belief statement. It's actually like a summarized lived experience for an audience or for an event. And getting people to think a little bit bigger about it. And what you do with the narrative then you go into message creation, you go into content creation in alignment with the narrative. The narrative research isn't going to give you an immediate tagline. That's work you have to do from a brand strategist perspective and a creative writing standpoint to pull out the creative and the content. The narrative is not going to be your content. You have to build content on top of the narrative.
Yeah,
Mm.
yes, true. And I think there's a job to be done in detailing that taxonomy a little bit and to
Mm,
create a standardized taxonomy that works across disciplines. For example, within marketing and comms, you have these very two different understandings of what a narrative is. I find that in PR and comms, the most people associate a narrative to the spin they
yep.
apply to whatever subject you're working on. And so it's quite tactical. And in marketing and insight, the association tends to be more with beliefs and behaviors, which is closer to what we're trying to do, but it's
Yeah.
still a lot looser than what we're actually doing in terms of like trying to identify and detect an item that is the narrative over time. So I think there's work to be done in defining the differences between a narrative, a message, a belief. Those are all different things that need to be analyzed and defined in context.
Yeah, for sure. And having to work together like with PR teams where marketing and creative and like the brand strategist side, like you said, we are looking at narrative of the research that we've seen, the insight we've found from our audience, but being able to work in alignment like with PR sometimes gets a little bit rough because like you said, there is the ability, well, that's not what the stakeholder wants, or that's not where the brand wants to go. So if that's the narrative, like you said, putting the spin on it, which is always kind of difficult from a brand perspective because you're like, well, sure, we can try that. It's not what the streets are saying, but hey, that's your job is to change change the idea and thinking from a PR perspective. But yeah, I think that's how those two work together. And I didn't think about it like that, but narrative on the PR side is very different from how we see narrative on the brand side sometimes, or the creator side.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm mindful that we keep this conversation going for ages. Like I really, really enjoyed hearing both you guys, but also that we've got some great questions coming through, and some of them are quite meaty ones. So it'd be great to have some time to like tackle those properly in the remaining 15 or so minutes we've got. And I think one of them actually really nicely leads on from what you guys were saying a minute ago, which was someone asked, and I want to get the name right, who it was. It was an anonymous attendee. I presume that's not their name. They said, is this a tool you see replacing standard social listening? I think there's a lot in that question. So maybe worth maybe starting with you, Fran, and yeah, coming back to that.
I think everyone has got a different workflow. In our case, we use them both, but at different stages of the process. So we start for narratives to explore and define the hypothesis that we think is interesting. Once we lock into a specific hypothesis that we want to validate, then we go into social listening to get the granularity of the insight on that specific aspect. And so we use narrative for discovery and context and get a measure of like what the different concepts are in the area that we're exploring. And then when we zoom in into one, we use social listening to do that in detail and understand the dynamics of the specific subject, the key influential voices, how information spreads within that audience, the audience behind it. So we use it in two steps. I don't think one replaces the other. I think narratives enhances what you can do with listening, and listening adds value to what you discover with narratives. But it's yeah, I think they're complementary.
Mm. Does that map
I
onto
have
your
to
experience? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I gotta agree. I would give it like I feel like narratives does a really good job with analyzing the volume, which from a standard social listening tool, like you'll have all those pieces, but you are wanting, and again, being able to cherry pick sometimes the things that you want from a social listening tool. I also think that narratives is something that you need to give it a runway and time to build. So I'm thinking from a brand standpoint or like doing analytical work. I wouldn't pull a narrative report every week or every month. I would give it a quarter, 6 months, a year. But my social listening reports, I could pull weekly, monthly, and being able to show kind of like the incremental changes. Also, social listening is for agility and being able to come up with things that are trending now, things that are happening in the ethos and in the world now. You think about trends being spotted in the social listening realm, where narratives is going to give you the narrative behind the trend, but you're going to see the trend happening in social listening. So there are two sides of one coin. I don't like Francis, I don't see one replacing the other, but they do highly complement each other. And being able to see what's happening from that day-to-day perspective from a social listening, but then adding historical context and narrative to the trend you're seeing, is how they've worked together for me.
Yeah, I think that's really nicely put. And I think it actually leads into the other question we had, which was someone saying, can you analyze or identify the narratives being discussed among specific demographic groups, for example? So people aged 18 to 34 living in Manchester, or doesn't need to be around a specific subject. I mean, some of that obviously, Fran, your best place to answer because of the product stuff. But I think a lot of that blend between looking at things in audience segments and looking at things in terms of like topics, you do get from that mix between social listening and narratives. But what do you reckon, Fran?
I think that's a very good question because it's something that we should be able to do. At the moment, you still can do that because we haven't indexed the narratives with an audience profile behind them, but it's what we're gonna do next. So we're gonna be associating an audience definition to every narrative. So every time you search into narratives, you'll be able to start searching by uh, concepts, or you can search by audiences as well. You can say like, I want to see what are the narratives that are like big in Gen Z, and I want to see narratives in Gen Z within food, or narratives in Gen Z within fashion. And that should be able to give you that grounding that you want, but it's not available in the product yet. It will be at some point.
So a nice sneak peek at what's coming up there. We do have a couple more product questions, which I guess probably maybe I've kicked you initially, Fran, but obviously, Safi, if you see anything there that touched on your broader experience, please do chip in. So someone's said, what news media is reported in narratives, and can you click through to the actual piece? So Fran.
Yeah, so you can, there's 5 million news articles a day going into narratives. Those are only online news articles. So any news organization that has a website that we collect and produce content in English is going to be in that 5 million news articles every day. So it's online news for now, English only, globally. Now we plan to add other languages to this, and we plan to add other media types. We've been looking at TV, radio, but we're probably going to start from podcasts. Podcast is quite interesting because of the depth of the conversation on a subject, but because of how long those items are, as opposed to an article where you have a title and a concise description of what the article is about. Podcasts require quite a lot of like work to make them manageable within the flow of narratives. But we're looking at a panel of 5 million podcasts that we're going to be bringing into narratives. So that's going to be quite interesting.
Yeah, that's going to be super cool.
Yeah,
I'm excited about that. Yeah, there's when you said podcast, I was like, whoa.
But people talk a lot. There's a lot of people talking, and when people talk a lot, so to be able to get the juice of the message out, it's quite a job already. So we're just focusing on that bit for now. Once we solve that problem, then we'll bring it in.
Yeah. I'm guessing podcasts would fit quite naturally into your workflow, Safi, in terms of when you're trying to find how these things stitch together. Like podcasts now have such an enormous impact on how these narratives develop.
Yeah, and I mean, even just thinking about like podcast, like as being and Fran, will podcast be tagged as like public media or as media?
Good question.
It depends. Okay. I was just curious because I know that again, like thinking about how many people are having conversations, it's almost like I'm even trying to wrap around my head, like, does it fit cleanly into media? Does it fit cleanly into public? Like, does it just depends on if it's New York Times podcast, but then there's someone else who just her and her friends have a podcast on the weekends they do, but it also has journalism integrity. That's glad a solution I don't have to present.
No, but I think I think the path that we're probably going to take is to categorize the podcast as media podcast versus grassroots podcast. Because if you just go by the idea of what is broadcast and what is not broadcast, then you should put podcast into media, right? But then an account on X with like 1 million followers is broadcast by any means, even though it's in a social network. So I think it's worth differentiating the podcast by who's a news organization that abides to certain rules of media reporting and media, production, versus who's doing it just because they have a voice and they have an audience. So yeah, but that's another problem on top of the complexity of like how long those items are.
Yeah.
We've got another question from Rob, who said, interested to hear the migration issue come up. And he says that he's the Deputy Director of the Migration Observatory of the University of Oxford. He said, you mentioned earlier tracking the genesis of a story through to completion. I'd be interested to see how the system can unpick narratives about migration from start points to end points and how the system defines that. Definitions of narratives also interesting here. Where do you get your definitions from other than general sense? So I think, a little bit of that's been covered, but definitely worth touching on it again here in more detail.
So let's start from the definition. So at the core of the narrative, there's a concept called context bundle. So a context bundle, and this is why the product is different from many similar solutions in NLP. So a context bundle is a group of posts on social media where people are having a conversation on a subject. So conversation might start from the NHS or the healthcare system in the UK for Safi, and who's joining from the US who doesn't know what the NHS is. And then someone in the comments might talk about immigration as being a problem for the NHS. Now, what we do is we keep building on the context for every unit of content that we're analyzing. And that context then becomes a cluster of ideas that are part of the same thread, if you like. And that same thread then becomes what we call a context bundle. So you get a DNA for what the thread is about. So in a thread about the NHS, if multiple people start associating the idea of immigration, narratives understand that the context bundle is made up of NHS plus immigration. And that association then gets kind of like cementified. So you know that it exists now. So then what you do is you start clustering in the data that you have, bottom up, without any top-down direction, anything that exists that associates the NHS and immigration. And then you start seeing different clusters forming up. And those clusters would be immigration is great for the NHS because it gives us doctors that we wouldn't have in the UK. Or immigration is too much, is putting a strain on the system. We don't have the resources for all those people that are coming in. These are two different narratives. But because we've built that association in the original context bundles, we can now start clustering our way out from the initial context bundles. And once you start having a bunch of these context bundles that start clustering together because they're similar on a daily basis, what you start doing is you start mapping them on a weekly basis. So then you go, all right, let's see if this context bundle in these specific clusters that we've identified about immigration being good for the NHS because it gives us doctors, let's see if it existed the day before. And so at that stage, what you do is an affinity check, semantic affinity between different clusters. And when you hit a certain similarity threshold, we build a link over time. And so then you start having a stretch, you know, from one day, it's gone back to a few days, it's gone back to a week. And then you repeat that process all the way back to whenever you start collecting data. In our case, we started like processing data like this at the beginning of 2023. And so we've basically been mapping these threads for more than 2 years now. And that thread becomes the narrative that you can then search when you input a keyword. What was the other question? I forgot.
The other question was just
or two parts of this question.
Yeah. It was seeing how interested to see how the system can unpick narratives about migration from start points to end points. So I think
So that's the way it technically works. But if you want, we can have a chat and we can look at what the system has been mapping out in terms of immigration. It'd be fun to do that because actually it's something that I've looked at. And one of the things that I've looked at is comparing the presence and the evolution of narratives in the media versus the evolution of the narratives in the public. And then on narratives, you can basically do an export of any topic. So it's a quick export that gives you all the themes and all the descriptions of the themes and the top narratives for each of the themes that you identified in that specific query that you've run. And it gives it to you in a CSV. So what I do that is like amazing, it's like magic, is I take that export, I put it into ChatGPT 5, and I go, give me an analysis of the perception on this topic according to the narratives that you have in this data set. And you can ask it whatever questions you want, and then you can ask it to compare it to the narratives in the media versus the narratives in the public. And the outputs you get are amazing because they're like AI polished outputs, but based on real data. So we're building an agent that actually does the narrative. When you can build like a category or a report in one click that goes like, take the export of these narratives, take the export of these other narratives in the public, compare them, give me that 10 slides that describe what is happening within skincare. And it can be as broad or as granular as you want it. But the fact that it's based on real data, when you feed it to a system like any LLM really, it adds all the layer of context that the LLM has on existing studies, for example, like survey that have been run on that topic, PDFs that exist on the subject. And that, it's just like a superpower, really, because you bring in the seed with the actual research and the quant data, but then you can enrich it with whatever context the LLM has.
That's great. Great answer. I'm conscious of time, and I know we've got another couple of questions. So I know that I think Vahid, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, sent over a couple of questions there. One of them was a bit more to do with data, and very happy to pick that up separately. I'm conscious Fran just answered one there, so I don't want to go too deep down that rabbit hole. But the other one you asked, which I think is very relevant, was how would you visualize the evolution of narratives to provide an outlook perspective? So you give the example of Safi's qualitative description of the evolution of the rapture. How would you also quantify and visualize that? So maybe it's like a closing question, and we can follow up with your other one separately, Vahid, in the email. Maybe let's answer that first.
And I can hop in there. I mean, with the way that narratives AI is set up, with how it breaks out the different narratives and the different themes, there's actually a component in there that shows you how the narrative changes. So it's like a timeline at the bottom, and it shows you the different breakouts. So the visualization there is pretty much already done in platform. You can go in and uncheck certain narratives. You can go in and uncheck certain themes, and it will just show you the growth line of popularity or indexing certain conversations. So it's pretty user friendly on the back end there, because all you need to do is do the query, then go into the individual, like tracking the themes, and you can just start to tab through what you would like, and you can export it as an image or as a PDF. So it Narratives AI actually does that for you if you want it visually representing like how things have changed. Or if you have your narrative at the end, it'll tell you all the other narratives. It'll show you visually what feeds into that theme or that narrative. So narrative, it actually already does that for you. You don't have to visualize it on your end if you don't want to.
Yeah, it's essentially it's a Sankey chart. I get very mistaken between my Sankey and my alluvials, which gets me in trouble with my data viz friends. But essentially, it's a Sankey chart, right? Which shows how these things branch over time, which obviously I'm biased, but it's a really neat way, I think, of visualizing a lot of what the dynamics you guys described, right? Where things branch, they come back together, they shoot off another direction, something comes in from left field. So that was incredibly untechnical. I'm not sure there's anything you'd add, Fran, just to bring us back to a slightly more technical.
I would have the same.
Yeah.
Also, we might change that. We just like, this is the design that we landed on, because we thought it kind of represented well the idea of different streams merging and splitting, but it might change at some point. We're just looking for the most performing way of doing this.
Yeah, brilliant. So I know we're going over time. I know, Vahid, we've got some other great questions from you. I think what I can do is send up an email to you afterwards. I'm conscious we didn't show any examples in this chat because it was very much a chat, so we can always stick those in the email. So everyone who's attended here will have this recording sent to them, and we can throw some resources in there. So if you are curious as to what this stuff looks like, you'll be able to see some examples. And yeah, Safi said earlier, very much would recommend checking out some of the work she's been doing too, because it's really, really awesome to have all these ideas, work on the product side, obviously Fran driving all of that, but then to actually see the stuff being used by people, like embracing it, really finding all these great use cases is so awesome to see. So thank you. Oh, sorry, Fran.
Where can we follow Safi? Like, I follow you on LinkedIn, but where else can we follow you?
LinkedIn is where I'm doing most of my narrative work right now. I'm trying to get into TikTok, but I just haven't started my cultural analytics TikTok yet. But typically I'm on LinkedIn, and there's not a lot of Safaniya Stevensons on there, so you should be able to find me pretty easily.
Follow Safi on LinkedIn, because there's like gems every week about narrative or anything. Like every time I see a post on Safi, that's a good idea in there. So like, good follow, it's good value.
Yeah,
I'm glad one person thinks so, Fred. That means a lot.
Brand consultant, your personal brand is very strong, I think, and everyone will see that. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate you giving us your time this afternoon, this morning, wherever you're joining from. And thank you as well to Fran and also to Safi, who, we love talking to. We'd love to hear from you again sometime soon. Anyone's got any questions that weren't answered here, ping them over. We'll get back to you on that. And thanks once again, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thanks all.
See ya.